Again, I'm Tony MacDonald, and the title of today's webinar is What's Up with Mid-Atlantic Offshore Wind, Ongoing Challenges and the Road Ahead. Again, there's been a lot of action on this issue over the last several years. There's a lot of questions that I've heard from constituents and stakeholders in New Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic region. There's also obviously a lot happening at the national level. So the basic question we're trying to really get across today is, how are the current headwinds impacting offshore marine renewable technology and energy policy in New Jersey and the region? And what are the prospects for the future? So really understanding not only where we've been, but where we are right now, and where we might be going in the future. Again, trying to think about what those questions are. So please, again, you all may have questions that didn't occur to us, so please be sure to put them in the chat. So we're really fortunate to have three folks who have been really immersed in the aspects of offshore wind, and they're going to be presenting today. We'll be starting off with Kris Ohleth. Kris is the Executive Director of the Special Initiative to Offshore Wind. She will be followed by Josh Kaplowitz. He is currently the Senior Counsel of Troutman, Pepper, and Locke. And finally, we'll have Kira Lawrence, who currently is the director of the UMass Clean Energy Extension and previously was with BPU in New Jersey. So really excited to kick off this webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Kris Ohleth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Just going to do a few minutes of opening remarks, and just wanted to do some level setting. Tony asked if I wouldn't mind just providing a bit of a perspective on offshore wind globally, a state of play here in the U.S., and then, kind of some of the current challenges and obstacles and opportunities that we have coming up in these years. So next slide, please. For some level setting, just to let folks know, there are about 15,000 offshore wind turbines spinning in the oceans around the world. The pie chart on the slide in front of you shows that about half of those are in China, and then the other half, more or less, are in European countries. We do have, a slice here in the United States at 5% of the global market, which, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what that represents here in the U.S. The state of play here in the U.S. for offshore wind, we've had two pilot projects complete and generating power now for quite a few years, the Block Island Wind Farm and the pilot Coastal Virginia offshore wind farm. We've had a smaller scale utility project, the South Fork Wind Farm, operating almost just about 2 years now, since March of 24, and we'll talk a little bit more about its operational data and the proof points we've seen so far from that project. As of a couple days ago, we can now say that we have 4 projects in construction. We had been saying 5 for quite a bit of time, but Vineyard Wind did kind of cross that threshold to be complete in construction last week up in Massachusetts. And then you'll see the other 4 projects listed here in construction, and their various stages of completeness: Revolution Wind, Empire Wind 1, Sunrise Wind, and the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Farm, their utility scale project. When these projects are complete this year, this will essentially, be delivering 6 gigawatts of offshore wind to the U.S. grid, which for, I don't know, folks like me who've now been doing this for over 20 years feels like, a bit of an accomplishment and, pretty good. I think the most important thing that these 6 gigawatts of offshore wind will help represent is this kind of first phase of utility scale development. And in case you're not familiar, we have been experiencing some challenges in the sector that, have been exacerbated by the past 14 months of the Trump administration. These challenges, they're evergreen challenges, ones, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later in the presentation. But, I think what these projects can represent for the sector are proof points. They will show the incredible reliability of offshore wind, its affordability, and its ability to be compatible with existing ocean users and resources. So we're looking forward to getting these 5 utility scale projects online this year. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those challenges to those projects. But if you could move to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the results from the South Fork Wind Farm over the past year. There are some criticisms of offshore wind saying that it doesn't have the capacity factor that is the, opportunity to deliver baseload power to the grid on a consistent basis. You can see here a really great result from the first one of the first years of South Fork Wind's capacity factor, delivering nearly 60% capacity to the grid, which is on par with natural gas resource delivery at this point, according to the Energy EIA. Information Administration. So this the graphic comes from Ørsted. The data is from the EIA. Really great performance results. Really getting to one of those proof points that we were speaking about earlier. If you could move to the next slide, please. Just wanted to talk about, what my sense is of where we are and what we can best do in some of these years where development may be a little slower with offshore wind. An analogy that comes to mind for me, one we often used over the past 2 decades, was that offshore wind was like flying the plane while you're building it. Well, at this point, the offshore wind plane is on the ground. And so can we use the time while the plane is on the ground to address some of these evergreen issues that I've listed here on the slide? And, we can talk a bit more about these in our Q&A and discussion. But first and foremost, an issue that I would like to address is the issue of market confidence. There have been challenges in the U.S. market because maybe you remember even before a year ago, projects were having challenges because their contracts with the state were really challenging to build at the prices that were bid in previous years. And this was due to inflation and geopolitical challenges and other forces outside of the developer's control. And so that market confidence has been shaken over the past few years, but really has been, now coming to a near rock bottom with the political challenges and headwinds here with the Trump administration. So in order to restore market confidence, we're really going to have to take a good look at procurement reform. So those would be the contracts that the states issue to purchase the offshore wind from the offshore wind developers. And then also some serious looks at permitting reform for durability of the contracts. And hopefully Josh will talk a little bit more about the relative success that I think we've seen in the projects getting through some of the challenges and scrutiny of their permits. Certainly an evergreen topic is transmission challenges, really addressing queue position security and grid upgrades. To date, we've really expected the offshore wind developers to address the lion's share of those things. And so, what my organization, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, has been doing is working across states to understand how they can also support some of those challenges. But, for example, offering letters of credit to the RTOs, to the regional transmission operators, to support a queue position, so it would not be completely the offshore wind developer wouldn't be completely responsible. Looking at some of those grid upgrades that would benefit ratepayers regardless of the technologies that are, put online. The third item here are permitting, regulatory, and legal hurdles, which I think Josh will talk more about, but really taking a hard look at some of the permitting and regulatory issues. Workforce development is a key issue that is a really long lead time item that we've been working on here in the U.S. for over a decade, and Kira's going to have some great things to say about that. And then last but certainly not least, and a point that I did want to leave you with, is the opportunity to mitigate social and environmental impacts. Offshore wind has been contributing a great deal of funding to ocean science and ocean studies over the past decade or so. And if you could move to the next slide, Carl, it'll be my exciting $50 million slide. Tony told us we weren't allowed to use a lot of words. So I wanted to share this graphic that the RWSC, the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, and the Regional Ocean Science Alliance, ROSA, have compiled great data for us about research projects since the middle of 2024 or so that have contributed over $50 million to wildlife and environmental research just in the past couple of years. And, I think one of the most important things we can continue to do is take a look at the baseline information that will really be needed over time and over scale, so that once, this is what we've been asking for a long time, is an opportunity and it's a space to get to some of these baseline data questions. And so it's excellent that these funds that have been coming in through the state procurement processes and such are now being applied, and really just encouraging folks out there, whoever has a voice in this, to continue to remind your stakeholders that this is really a great pathway to being very productive in the years that we may have some more opportunity to do this kind of work. So with that, Tony, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. And before I turn it over to Josh a little bit, and I'll come back a little bit, I wonder if I can put you on the spot a little bit in terms of the special initiative and thinking about, what you would focus on in terms of engaging the community. And, I think one of the themes across this webinar is kind of maybe the misalignment between the state and federal policy worlds, the misalignment between the community expectations and frameworks, and maybe a misunderstanding, a misalignment about what the benefits are from an economic point of view. So if you have one or two things you think the special initiative would like to focus on to be able to kind of build out the record a little bit more clearly to correct some of those misalignments, are there one or two things that occur to you?
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. Thanks for asking. I mean, it's what I think about all the time. One thing that I think would be really beneficial in this time, especially, would be an opportunity to do just kind of broader education about the importance of resource adequacy and the challenges we have to our grid. I think offshore wind falls really squarely in being able to meet a lot of needs, but I think essentially there are a lot of even higher level stakeholders in our ecosystems that don't have a good understanding of why we wanted to do offshore wind in the first place. And, we all know that we have been leading with the what, which is offshore wind. So taking a step back and the opportunity to lead with the why, I think could be a really powerful opportunity in this intervening time.
Great. I appreciate that. Okay, Josh, if we can ask you to kind of pick it up, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So Josh Kaplowitz, I'm currently counsel at Troutman Pepper Locke. We're a nationwide law firm. But in the prior capacity, I was the vice president for offshore wind advocacy at American Clean Power. And then before that, served as an attorney advisor to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at the Solicitor's Office between 2015 and 2020. So I have seen most phases of the roller coaster that has been offshore wind over the last decade plus. And I wanted to kind of laser in a little bit on one point that Kris made, which is the sort of the what has been done to, the question of like what has been done to offshore wind in this administration since January of 2025. I think it's important to do a look back and also, sort of think through what's next, because I think the questions, the lessons learned there can inform what we need to do for the next couple of years to prepare for a time when there will be that federal political support. Next slide. So I'm going to break this discussion up into really three buckets of agency actions. The first bucket, the stop work and suspension orders, those are have primarily or exclusively affected the 5 projects that have been under construction. Again, Vineyard graduating to operational, Revolution Wind on the cusp of that. But those have been these are the actions that have targeted those very mature under construction projects. And those are the ones that get most of the headlines. But we also need to think through what has happened with respect to the projects that were coming up right behind. And those are the projects, the sort of class of projects that have their COP approval, their construction and operation plan, the main sort of permit approval from BOEM, but have not gotten to that stage of final investment decision and contracting and sort of mobilization of offshore construction. And then the third category, these programmatic actions that sort of impact the sort of broadly applicable rules that apply to offshore wind permitting, these have really primarily affected the projects coming behind the ones with COP approval, the ones that have yet to achieve their COP approval, primarily on leases that have been issued more recently, particularly during the Biden administration. So next slide. So we'll start with the ones that have been making the headlines, these stop work and suspension orders. I think starting, at the beginning of this administration, there was a lot of trepidation, but a lot of people went in thinking, okay, once these projects have steel in the water and are starting construction, they should be safe, because they're underway. They're very close to generating electricity, and we're, evidently in an energy emergency. We found out in April of last year that that was not the case. When BOEM, seemingly out of nowhere, issued what they termed a stop work order aimed at the Empire Wind project. Now, this project was just about to start pile driving their first piles on their lease, and the order was like it was just a one-page order. Didn't really specify why this was happening, other than sort of vague language about environmental concerns through NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which deals with marine species and fisheries issues. Now, this order ended up being rescinded in about a month later, and it was widely reported that this was because the administration and Governor Hochul in New York had reached a deal wherein the project could go forward in exchange for Governor Hochul supporting some onshore gas pipelines. But fast forward a couple months, and in August, an order came in targeting Revolution Wind, and this was the project right off of Rhode Island. And what was jarring about this project was it was 80% complete. All the piles had been driven, and many of the wind turbines had already been installed, and yet it was being stopped. And the justification this time was generalized language about national security concerns. Well, this time the developer Ørsted filed suit. There was already litigation going on, sort of NIMBY lawsuits challenging their approval, and they went into court, got the same judge, and very quickly got in what's called a preliminary injunction to get that stop work order essentially put in abeyance, sort of frozen, so that they could go out and restart construction. Notably, the government did not appeal that preliminary injunction order. So Revolution Wind got back out on the water. All these other projects are still engaged in construction. But then you fast forward another couple months, and you will probably all recall right before Christmas on December 22nd, 5 orders came out, and this time they were termed suspension orders. We were suspending the lease, but they had the same effect of halting construction, this time on all 5 of the projects that were actively under construction. And it was predictable. The response here was predictable. All 5 projects, all 5 developers went to court and sought the same preliminary injunction to get back to very quickly get back to work. Now, this time around, the administration through BOEM proffered national security justifications, but this time they said, well, we've done more analysis, and we have identified new threats. But they wouldn't tell anyone the threats, certainly not the public, but they also wouldn't tell the developers or engage with the developers on purported mitigation measures that might be necessary. Now, in court, the government argued essentially, okay, well, here's our justification is national security. Yes, well, they also contested whether it was actually causing harm. So to get an injunction, let me back up. So to get an injunction, you have to show legally that you're going to win, that the action is likely to be found illegal, And they made lots of arguments under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, that you've suffered irreparable harm and will continue to do so unless the illegal action is enjoined, is stopped, and then that it is in the public interest to enjoin this action, and that the balance of harms favors the party that's being harmed and is seeking the injunction. And so the court, all five courts, spoiler alert, found that there was harm and that the injunction was justified. And they found it notable that this national security justification, which we don't know exactly what it was, only the government admitted it only applied to operation of the wind turbines and not construction, and yet these orders stopped construction but let operating turbines continue to operate. And all the judges sort of found that to be irrational, to use a word that one of the judges used. So here we are, all these projects are back, are back under construction. Some are complete or near completion. And, the question is, what is next? There has been no appeal of the first one, so we're kind of waiting to see whether these other orders are going to be appealed. But I think a big lesson to be learned from this is that all the work that went into permitting these projects paid off. The judges were persuaded that BOEM had, among other things, very carefully addressed national security issues, including through regular consultations with the Department of Defense. So, I think it's a credit to BOEM, it's a credit to all the federal agencies that did the hard work to get these projects to this point, that courts were persuaded that they had done it the right way. So where do we go from here? I mean, obviously these projects have lost a lot of money along the way. But we don't know whether new orders are coming, or whether they will let these projects go forward and sort of take a signal from these decisions. Next slide. So the next category, and I'll try to go faster with these, is these projects that have COP approvals, but again haven't reached the construction phase. And what's essentially happened here is these projects, like all offshore wind projects, essentially have faced NIMBY lawsuits. And what has happened is the Department of Justice, representing the government, has essentially flipped sides in these suits. So typically, the Department of Justice would defend the permits that their client agencies have issued, and instead, midway through last year, you saw the DOJ basically say, well, we've changed our mind. We don't think these permits are legally supportable anymore. And they've essentially moved to try to what's called remand, like claw back the permits and quote unquote reconsider them. And in one case, actually tried to ask for permission to completely rescind or vacate the permit. So it's unclear, what's going to happen here. No, to be clear, these cases are all pending, and none of these permits have been sort of formally revoked. And again, one of the reasons why I think we should be confident that they won't be is because of the incredible work that BOEM and all the other agencies did in issuing these permits. The basis that the government has offered for why these permits need to be reconsidered really has nothing to do with the quality of the analysis. It's a sort of technicality, a new legal interpretation that they think warrants it. So they're trying to sort of rescind these permits on what I would sort of characterize as a legal technicality, which is frankly not a very strong basis for many reasons that I can talk to folks offline about. But practically speaking, these have had very real effects, and you've seen developers sort of say that in their declarations in these projects. It's hard to move forward with a project when you know that the government is threatening, holding the sword of Damocles over your head and threatening to rescind your permits. So, I think, there are lessons learned about sort of how we make sure going forward that these permits are are safe from these types of sort of second guessing actions in subsequent administrations. And it's actually a major part of permitting reform is putting provisions in that make sure that a final permit is final and can't be just rescinded for for arbitrary reasons. Next slide. So we'll get to the last. So this is the last category of lawsuits and legal actions, and these again have to do with the projects that have not gotten their approvals yet, or those are the ones that are most affected. And this started literally from day one. If you'll recall, the Wind Presidential Memorandum that was issued on January 20th of last year, and one of the main things it did was put a freeze on any further approvals of any wind project, including onshore and offshore projects. Now the industry and 18 states or 17 states in the District of Columbia did sue to stop this in May of last year. And in December, it took a little longer than we had hoped, but in December, the court did vacate this freeze. But the problem is, in the interim, this administration issued a sort of a series of other orders and directives that functionally had the same effect of freezing permitting. And this expanded from these orders expanded the target from not just offshore wind to also onshore wind and solar on public lands and even on private lands. So more lawsuits were clearly needed. And in December, actually a day after the December 22nd stop work order, so it went a little bit under the radar, 8 regional trade associations advocating for renewable energy filed suit actually in Massachusetts in the same court where the wind memorandum suit was filed to try to get all of these other orders vacated. And that suit is still ongoing. We had a hearing. Actually, my firm has been fortunate enough to represent the industry in this case, and we had a hearing 2 weeks ago today. So, knock on wood, we will get a favorable order in the coming weeks. But the question then is, okay, will this, what difference will this make if if the response is just to find other ways to sort of functionally do the same thing and clog up permitting? Again, not just for offshore projects, but also for onshore wind and solar. So, a lot remains to be seen. But again, thinking through if it was this easy to kind of clog everything up, what are some reforms that we can introduce in the coming years to make sure that a sort of politically motivated effort to essentially shut down an industry can't happen quite so easily. So I will kind of leave it there, and I know we're going to have a Q&A to unpack these, but I'll turn it over to Kira now.
Thank you very much. There is one question in the chat. I'll just jump right into it because I think it's directly relevant to something you talked about, which was a question from Matt Gove relative to the folks who have gotten permits along the way and have won the right to do the leasing, et cetera. Do they hold on to those in the future? Let's assume we work through the lawsuits. Do the previous folks does that carry forward? And would their information still be good? They might have to update it. But what would be the status of the impact, assuming it clears a little bit? What are the current rights of those folks who have gotten permits?
Well, I guess there are 2 questions bundled in there. If you have your permit, it should still be valid. These permits don't expire. Now, if technologies have advanced or you in the interim have found better ways to do things and those aren't part of the project description, you might need to submit a revised proposal, and hopefully a sort of understanding administration will process that quickly and it'll provide minimal delay. If you have not gotten your approval yet, you're gonna have to look at but you're still sort of in a better regulatory environment are still inclined to develop your project, you're going to probably need to look at your data and make sure that it is still still fresh and valid, and that it hasn't gotten stale. So there may be the need to conduct additional surveys, but the hope would be that developers who have been sort of in limbo for the last year and a half and may continue to be won't need to start from scratch. But to Kris's point earlier, it's really important that we think through, start with our North Star of what does a regulatory environment look like that will incentivize the investments, the checks being written for multiple millions and billions of dollars, that will encourage the sort of expenditure and investment of resources.
Great thing. I do see some other questions in the chat, but I want to give Kira a chance to add some of her remarks before we get back to those. So thanks, Josh. So Kira.
Great, thank you. So I'm Dr. Kira Lawrence. I'm currently the director of the UMass Clean Energy Extension, but prior to my work here in Massachusetts, I was with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities as one of the core members of the offshore wind team. I'll say that at the top here that some of the things I'm going to say are going to echo things that Kris and Josh said. I actually think that's a good thing because you've got three different perspectives and we're converging on some of the same issues as critically important for needing to be addressed. Next slide, please. I'm going to actually start with framing offshore wind in the context of a larger energy landscape that we are experiencing right now in the Mid-Atlantic region. So we have surging energy demand. That's evident from the graphs I put on the right-hand portion of this slide, which come from PJM's load forecast that was released in January 2026. And PJM is if you will, the regional transmission organization. Kris referenced them earlier. You can think of them as the traffic cop for the grid. They are ensuring that the lights stay on across this giant region of 67 million people from Illinois to New Jersey and down to Virginia and North Carolina. So a huge task. What you can see from these graphs is while there's some variability during the early part of this record, if you look off into the future, the green and blue lines, you see a dramatic increase in the load or the demand for energy. So this load growth is driven by several factors, but the primary cause is data center load growth. Need to have AI data centers have power to do their work. So this is causing, as most folks are aware, an affordability crisis, and it's been part of the conversation across the region, most notably perhaps in the recent gubernatorial race in New Jersey and Virginia. If we don't act vigorously to address this challenge, we will also have a reliability challenge for the grid. So we need to not only understand how real this load growth is, and ensure that the rules protect ratepayers over multi-billion-dollar companies. But we also need, and this is my second point in this slide, new, safe, reliable generation as soon as possible. We need all the tools at our disposal on the table to try and confront this challenge. And I would submit that offshore wind should be part of the solution because it's a proven technology, as Kris noted in her first slide, very widely used across the globe with great success. It has a high capacity factor, also a point that Kris's slide made. It's close to East Coast load centers, so not as far to go with the transmission lines. It is possible of delivering gigawatt scale energy. I'll note that the fuel is free from the atmosphere. It's a consequence of pressure gradients that are driven by the different way that land and ocean respond to being heated, and that will persist for all of time. And it helps reduce the volatility of energy prices, right? Diversifying our portfolio makes us less vulnerable to shocks to specific resource types, like those that are being experienced by some of the fossil fuel markets as a consequence of foreign conflicts right now. As Kris noted, there are 6 gigawatts of projects operating or under construction, and there are gigawatts more of projects that have won offtake awards, including many of them that are fully permitted. And that means that they're closer to being able to deliver energy if they came to fruition. Next slide, please. So there are a number of things that we need to do to try and reboot the offshore wind industry in the United States. And I have these broadly in the category of de-risking offshore wind. Some of the challenges here And, Kris talked about these, some Josh also, so I'll try and just do this efficiently, but maybe make the point from a slightly different perspective, which I think has utility. So some of the challenges at the super long development timeline, right? So I'm showing here in the top right portion of the slide, BOEM's timeline for the development of an offshore wind project. And if you do the math here on the numbers, you get to roughly 10 years from the inception of a lease area to the commercial operation of a project. So think about all the things that happened between 2016 and now, right? We had a global pandemic. We've had massive inflation, lots of significant macroeconomic factors. We've had multiple foreign conflicts that have impacted energy prices and supply chains. And the long timeline for development means that those macroeconomic factors can have a really big impact on the business case and on the timeline for a project, which means that the project viability gets jeopardized. The other challenge is that at least in existing procurement processes, and certainly I'm most familiar with New Jersey's, but the largely inflexibility of that, right? Once an award is made and a price is agreed upon, that's the price in which that company is going to deliver energy. I think states got a little bit more thoughtful about this in more recent awards and added in an inflation adjustment mechanism. And certainly any major infrastructure project is also going to put contingency in their plans. But even those efforts to try and ensure project completion were jeopardized, and as we've seen across the Eastern Seaboard, by these major impacts of macroeconomic factors and by a changing political landscape. The final point of challenges, and there are many more, but these are just the highlights from my perspective, is that along with these projects, we have sought to also achieve major economic development in states along the Eastern Seaboard. And while that, was an effort to result in significant job growth and economic benefits to each state, which I think are meritorious goals, it puts a lot on a generation project to have that necessarily part of their award for generating, electricity. So some potential solutions include, I think, permitting reform. Kris and Josh both made this point. Let's shorten the duration of the timeline that I'm showing here on the slide. And we need permitting certainty. I think Josh made talked about this with some specificity, but anybody in the energy sector should be concerned when a change in administration results in permits that are now in jeopardy, right? Not only offshore wind projects, but major energy infrastructure projects are hundreds of millions to billions of dollars worth of investment. No company, regardless of the type of generation, wants to have permitting uncertainty. So I think I'm hopeful that there's bipartisan support for trying to get to that certainty. And I think it would be a significant benefit to the certainty for future offshore wind projects. This is something that happens in Europe. My next point, have the government handle some of the environmental impact studies. So the Europeans do this, and I think we might benefit from emulating that model. As Kris noted, there's been quite a lot of investment in trying to understand the environment and ecosystems off the coastlines of the Eastern Seaboard and what potential impacts offshore wind might have on them. So there's a lot of research that has happened and is going on. So there's a huge foundation upon which to build. And I think rather than having individual projects invest, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to understand the unique circumstance for their lease area, a lot of that information is duplicative amongst the different projects. We could start with a baseline of information and just have the projects do the piece that is pertinent to their specific lease area. So this next point, solicitations focus on the cost to deliver energy. This is the point about, having generation projects build an array and plug that project into the grid and have that be the expectation as we reboot, rather than having them also have to shoulder a whole suite of economic development aspirations. I think those will come if we prove that the offshore wind industry is viable in the United States. And finally, the last point is that the development risk we probably need to share. Kris made a point about the fact that the market is pretty spooked right now, given the recent actions of the federal government. And I think a point that is worth making with clarity is that the developers don't get paid until electrons hit the grid. So there's often hundreds of millions, if not, up to roughly $1 billion worth of investment that happen before those projects can actually recover their costs. And in order to entice these companies that have done this successfully in many other places back to the US market, sharing the development risk, I think, is going to be important. Have there be milestones, significant milestones on the way to development before COD, in which they can recover some of their costs. Next slide, please. This is a point, I think, that echoes what Kris said. Let's work on implementing these lessons learned right now, because that's going to put us in a better position to reboot the offshore wind industry and have it help address the significant need for safe, clean, reliable energy that is the reality of the energy landscape in which we exist right now. So I'm not going to belabor these points, but I'm going to echo my colleagues' remarks about the need for regulatory reform, right? And that probably on a state level, the laws and the rules, we need to take a good hard look at those and think about how we're going to address some of the challenges that I noted on the previous slide. I think the second point is a significant need for regional collaboration. And I'd say that one of the few silver linings of this moment in the offshore wind industry in the United States is that now state teams actually have a chance to take a little bit of a breath. These are not managing as many projects or solicitations, and have the chance to work together towards a common set of goals that we all share with respect to the development of the offshore wind industry. So I'm showing here on the right-hand portion of the slide the high voltage transmission system in PJM, and just noting that there aren't that many places where it reaches to the shoreline. And so there's a significant need for coordinated transmission in order to capitalize on the better plug-in spots into the grid. And by sharing that effort, you can drive down the costs rather than doing multiple different efforts to try and upgrade the grid and plug in myriad projects in different places. So New Jersey has led the way in terms of coordinated transition. There are also some success in New England. We need more of that. We should work together on supply chain rather than competing for different pieces of the supply chain. We should think about where we best situate different pieces of the supply chain along the Eastern Seaboard and all work together to support that goal so that we have the order book volume that's needed in order for the supply chain to become real in North America. Solicitations, there's been some success in New England on running joint solicitations. I think we should contemplate that in the Mid-Atlantic as well. In addition, we should all think about trying to coordinate our solicitation timelines such that we're not competing for scarce resources. And here I'll just note, for example, vessels that are capable of installing offshore wind farms. And the final point here is an effective communication strategy. We all have thoughts and ideas about the benefits of offshore wind, many of which align. I think we all need to get on the same page and work towards a coordinated, proactive communication strategy that seeks to engage stakeholders across all levels, right? The folks in the highest levels of governors at the highest levels of state government at the governor's level, and all the way across the spectrum to residents on the ground who are concerned about potential adverse impacts. And I guess that's the last point that I'll seek to make is, and Kris noted this as well, there have been a series of longstanding concerns about potential impacts that are related to the environment and also to economic impacts, particularly for shore communities, whether that's the fishing industry or the tourism industry. Now is the time for us to continue to study these potential impacts. We're building on a strong foundation from ROSA and RWSC and from the Research and Monitoring Initiative in New Jersey and similar programs like that in other states. We really have, I think, a strong foundation, and we need to continue to do that work. And with respect to economic impacts, there are these projects that are either installed or being installed. Now's the time to go to those communities and understand what the baseline is, and then as those projects get installed, have a longitudinal study that helps us understand whether or not there's been a significant change to those communities as a consequence of the wind farms. And that's information that will help inform a reboot. And I'll just conclude by saying, I think we got to do this work now in order to build for the opportunity to go again towards the end of this decade. And I think we need the policy work, the policy framework to be built out in a way that makes the opportunities more viable for the development of this, I think, important part of our energy future along the Eastern Seaboard. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you, Tony, for the opportunity to speak today.
Great, thank you. That was great. And again, I see some questions piling up in the chat. We'll try to get to them. I want the panelists a chance to kind of expand on each other's comments or ask each other's comments, but I did have a couple of quick questions that I kind of would start us off a little bit. And I want to follow up with Kira a little bit about something I'm not familiar with. I mean, I'm Urban Coast Institute is very involved with the regional ocean planning process, which is the 5 states looking more at the ocean data portal and deconflicting uses. And so familiar with that, but are there mechanisms in place for this multi-regional, multi-state coordination around some of the things that you were talking about? Are there mechanisms in place around shared transmission, shared scheduling, a framework? So what are the mechanisms for that?
Absolutely. I think there are several mechanisms. I'll just give one example. The Northeast States Collaborative, which is run by Abe Silverman and folks from Johns Hopkins University with support from Sue Glatz, who used to work from PJM, is an effort by 9 states along the Eastern Seaboard to think about how we move forward on coordinated transmission, for example, both offshore and onshore. And those forums, I think, are great for all getting on the same page about how we advance our shared goals and actually thinking about the details about how we would execute on that. So there is a big piece of that is related to how we might build an offshore backbone, and not only the technology, but also the governance that would be required to execute on that. I'll say that those conversations, I think, are productive not only for the planning and the technical problem solving that they entail, but also for the relationship building amongst folks who are in decision-making positions in the states that are working on the offshore wind industry. And I'll say that there are incredibly bright people working across state governments to try and bring this industry to life for the benefit of their individual states and ratepayers, but also for the benefit of the region. And I think that these kinds of fora have built relationships in a way that allow us to build out from, for example, these conversations that have mostly focused on how do we do the transmission piece of this. And so I think there is a real opportunity for those relationships to expand to other sectors. I talked about transmission. There's also been conversations about how we collaborate on supply chain. And so a number of these different areas, states are already working together. And as I noted in my remarks, I think there's in this a bit of a lull time, we really have an opportunity to focus more of our bandwidth on those kind of collaborative efforts that I think are critically important to the wind industry along the Eastern Seaboard moving forward.
Great. I appreciate that. Okay, so again, I don't know, Josh, Kris, did anybody want to expand or respond to any of the questions or dig a little deeper based on what you heard from the other presenters?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just kind of touch back with Josh on a couple things. I mean, I think we talk about durable permitting and how important that is to investor and market confidence moving forward. One could argue that, the permits were pretty durable in these cases. They've been attacked from every angle, and each time they've been, successful in holding, thanks to BOEM and others. So I guess, do you have like a wish list of what you'd like to see, and how can we think about that durability question?
I mean, it's a great point, right? Like there's, on one level, there's not a ton you can do if you have, an administration that doesn't care about court outcomes or really the law. But I think there are ways, like in permitting reform, to make the law clearer. I think the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is pretty clear, but it could be clearer, and you could absolutely sort of clarify and have a 100% airtight statement of congressional intent that like we passed this statute and we expanded it to offshore wind in order to deploy offshore wind. And we don't, and what we don't mean is that there should be a legal standard for review of these projects that results in every project being disapproved. And that is pretty much how this administration has interpreted OXLA, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. So, because there is even a scintilla of uncertainty there, that sort of has had a ripple effect on sort of discouraging investment. There are, just because you have a COP approval doesn't mean that you have the green light. There are subsequent regulatory steps that have to happen. You have to submit a facility design report, a fabrication installation report for review. We could put some stronger protections that make sure that once you have a COP approval, like there is no way, absent some a very defined set of unforeseen circumstances, that you as the regulator can get in the way of going from COP approval to steel in the water. The legislative proposals that are out there have been sort of kicked around on Capitol Hill have language that very specifically says, and this is pan technology, right? Because I think an important point to make here is the attacks on offshore wind are a playbook for another administration to attack energy technologies and industries that they don't like. And I think everyone kind of recognizes that once you sort of open up Pandora's box, you create a situation in which no investment in infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, is viable in this country because, why would you sink money into, a project that has, permitting and sort of development timelines that by definition are going to extend beyond one presidential administration. So if we can create rules, ideally legislatively, that make sure that what you get in one administration can carry through, and that the next administration, just make crystal clear that the next administration can't just swoop in and yank away rights that you have. I think that would make a huge difference in terms of making investors more willing to sink the kind of money that it takes to build not just offshore wind but transmission infrastructure, even gas infrastructure. Like there is a problem that cuts across, that has been sort of unleashed here, targeted at offshore wind, that cuts across lots of different industries, and solving the problem for offshore wind, I think, solves it for the country overall.
And I'll just jump in and say that I think that setting the kind of precedent of the uncertainty about permitting at this time, when it's not just PJM, right, but we're watching energy demand surge across the country,
Exactly.
It's a particularly problematic time to be injecting uncertainty about the viability for energy projects of any flavor, right? So if you set the precedent, as Josh just, I think, very thoughtfully laid out, you got issues and question marks for the whole industry. And this is exactly not the time for that to happen.
So hey, I want to, before getting to the specific questions, I just want to kind of go, an observation on that in general, and then a follow-up, a broader question, which is, again, well, I think many of the presenters and myself greatly appreciate sort of the knowledge at the table here around things like PGM and the technicalities of the legal lawsuits and so forth. That's just not the level on which most of the communities follow issues, and it's very difficult to understand that. It's also, discussing these in the context of energy policy, which is, I think, there's a new degree of urgency on that, right? And so there's also the state energy policies we'll come back to in terms of their renewable energy goals. So I want to come back to that, but I guess, I just want to kind of see if I can channel the community perspective a little bit that doesn't really understand all of those niceties and say what. So yes, complying with permits, good, doing NEPA reports, getting approvable permits, but I do think there's also continues to be the public, not really a misalignment between what I call the broad term environmental benefits of renewable energy and what it adds to the economic system, and what I call at least the shorter term concerns about the actual impacts of the projects on the ecosystem. And as somebody who kind of works on regional ocean planning and thinks about how do I protect healthy ecosystems, we were very interested at UCI on all the great work that was being done in the region to really characterize. We've been wanting that investment in ocean observing systems and framework systems in understanding the impact on fisheries. And again, for those who don't know, Kira referred to the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative and the Regional Ocean Science Alliance, which are really doing a lot of fantastic work, and hopefully we'll continue to do the work and kind of looking at the impacts in the ocean and the characteristics of fisheries. So how do we kind of narrow that gap in terms of the public understanding of the environmental impacts? It's not just on the legal basis, but really a degree of confidence that the benefits, the multiple benefits of these projects. Anybody want to jump into that one?
I mean, I'll just say the great news there is we have more than 6 gigawatts worth of laboratory to study. We have proof of concept. So let's spend a lot of this year, a lot of the intervening time period, demonstrating that these projects, obviously do what they're supposed to do in terms of generating electricity into the grid at high capacity factors, which is as advertised. But also that the environmental impacts on fisheries, on benthic habitats, on marine mammals is manageable and is not so great that it should deter these projects from more offshore wind projects from going forward.
Kira, you have thoughts? Any thoughts from you?
I do. Yeah, happy to jump in
Thank
here.
you.
So I'll say a couple things. I think Josh is exactly right, and I think he's echoing the point I was trying to make with my slides, which is we should absolutely continue to fund RWSC, ROSA, RMI, and the like all along the eastern seaboard to, as Josh put it, look at the potential impacts of the 6 gigawatts that are going in. We have, I think, already some data from Block Island and Seaval, right? Those are those early projects that Kris referenced that I think is pretty encouraging. And we have lots of information that comes from the European example, right? The Europeans were quite thoughtful about how they did environmental monitoring and, impact testing. Our team and the team at DEP took a very close look at that when we were putting the RMI together to try and understand what types of studies that we needed to fund and also what potential impacts would happen with the installation of wind farms. I think encouragingly, in Europe, even years into their efforts, they were still talking about potential adverse impacts. Right? That's not to say there are no impacts, and that all of them are positive. Right? There certainly are some potential adverse impacts, but that from the European assessment, the benefits outweighed the costs. And I think that helped give us confidence that, while we can't transfer exactly the ecosystems in Europe to North America and say, we're done, right? That's why we funded all the work with RMI and other types of entities, that we feel like we have pretty well covered the types of organisms and the physical and chemical aspects of the ocean that need to be assessed, but feel pretty good about the benefits of offshore winds outweighing the adverse impacts from an environmental standpoint. So I think we're more work needs to be done. Let's keep funding those entities. I will say that one thing that we did with the RMI, and I think Kris I think you were even part of the project team, was to fund a project that had experts from across the wind ecosystem that were tied to environmental impacts. And Tony, you too, actually, perhaps part of that project, in which we were seeking to think about ocean co-use in a way that was best for all stakeholders, right? Wind farms, and then all sorts of all the other uses of the New York Bight, for example, and how we might install a bunch of monitoring and testing device using offshore wind farm infrastructure to better inform thoughtful co-use of the ocean and also to contribute to ecological studies in a way that could be largely standardized along the Eastern Seaboard so that we had the kinds of data sets that we would need to do to be able to make informed decisions about where we sited the wind farms and what potential impacts they might have. And so I would respectfully submit that we should follow the advice that was distilled from that study. I don't know whether either of the two of you would like to say more about that, but that's the kind of, I think, forward thinking that we need to have with respect to environmental issues. And I think a lot of great work has been done. And we probably, back to a point that I made earlier, need to work on effectively communicating the results of that work to the stakeholders who are raising concerns about the potential impacts.
Yeah, I appreciate you shouting out that. That wasn't not a setup. So thank you, Kira. But I do think it was, sort of where I come at this a little bit, not being an expert the way you all on the specifics of it, is though a broader consideration of what an ecological observing system would be that has multiple benefits beyond the impacts of offshore wind specifically, about really thinking about, very concerned about right whales, right? So there's a very concerned. I happen to be in DC meeting with some folks from BOEM and other folks, and there's now an interest in actually sand and offshore mineral resources off of Virginia, and thinking about what the impact. They said, oh, maybe we need those right whale studies now. So really understanding that there are multiple benefits from doing these baseline studies relative to futures of fisheries and ecological systems that we could also benefit from. And a lot of investment was going on in the region, and innovative things like marine environmental DNA and other kind of techniques, which might, and also sensor development and other things. So again, I'm from the multiple benefit community, so I really feel like thinking about how we leverage these investments to inform other things that I know everybody in the region does care about is another aspect, which is hopefully can find a little bit more ground for consensus around the trade-offs. Kris, did you want to pop in with anything specific on that?
Yeah, I did, Tony. Just briefly, I think totally echo everything that I'm hearing from the other panelists. But for me, what I wanted to add was the how. The how I see this happening is with, investment from the states. The states are the ones who really have the reins in this intervening period. We've seen great legal work from them pushing back on the Trump administration. Saw a really interesting RFI come out from the state of New York a couple weeks ago about how they can best use investments in this intervening time. When you look at the European model, where offshore wind has been more successful and more continuous, we really see a lot of that kind of early stage development risk taken from the developers and the states applying resources to that. So, looking at, the lease areas and how they're generating wind speeds, doing those studies in advance. So that's not a responsibility of the developers, having them, do more of the environmental work, and almost, kind of having areas that are, pre-permitted or cleared. And, back in the day, New Jersey did some great baseline studies, right, in the aughts. I mean, that was a while ago now, but, refreshing some of those studies, like now's a great time to be doing some of that work. And, those early dollars that developers spend, those are very risky dollars. And so the more the states, I see the how being the states really kind of stepping up to the plate and being able to overall reduce the cost of electricity for their residents, because they're getting more supply into the grid in the quickest way we can by streamlining these projects.
Great. Thanks. There was a specific question I just didn't want to pass by. Somebody asked who would be the expert that we could refer to them on the impact on cetacean and avian populations. And I would have answered the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative would be the group that I would recommend looking into. They have pretty active work groups on all those specific issues. And if they're not the experts, they are working with the experts. So unless anybody has any other suggestion, Eddie, that's what I would suggest you looking at that group. And they have a lot of information on their website. They do a wonderful job.
I just put the link in the chat for them, Tony. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, and again, I don't know, it's relatively new news, but there was a question whether anybody wanted to comment on the recent news regarding the potential of settlement of some of the lawsuits. Again, don't want to get anybody out ahead of their skis, but there is a question about the news this week about settling some of the lawsuits. Anybody have any insights to that?
So just a clarification there. It's not actually they're using the word settlement awfully loosely there. It's actually not settlement of active lawsuits. What the administration is trying to do, as I understand it, is essentially cut deals with leaseholders who have not submitted or gotten COPs approved to essentially say we'll refund you the cost of your lease acquisition, and in exchange you'll take that money and spend it over in Texas on building sort of natural gas projects. At least that's the example that was given in the New York Times article. I mean, obviously, it's unfortunate. A lot of work went into pre-studies and citing these leases in the best place to balance ecological impacts and commercial development and need for electricity. So you would hate to see that work be undone, especially in a time when we need as much energy as possible. I don't want to rehash that. But the other point is that money that is being refunded, that's our money as taxpayers. So, the idea of that money being just kind of given away doesn't sit so well. And I think there's some real questions about the legality of whether you can sort of cut these kind of deals to essentially give away taxpayer money without sort of the appropriate process. And I mean, it is kind of extortion. It's like, here, take this deal, or we're going to go after you and try to cancel your leases, which legally they actually can't do. So,
well, and I think to just layer onto that, Josh, the company, and thank you for posting the article in the chat. Whomever did that, the story that broke just yesterday, so we're excited to be on breaking news with you all, was about a company who has existing fossil assets in the United States under consideration by this administration. So the kind of quid pro quo that would be required here really is completely inappropriate to say, well, let's cancel a clean energy lease and kind of essentially pay you off to focus on hydrocarbons. I don't think that's anywhere we want to be as a nation, that the federal government is brokering those kind of deals. It's just bad government.
Well, and again, I keep coming back to the precedent that it sets in future administrations. I think that theme kind of runs through this discussion. Offshore wind is a bit of a guinea pig for like bad policy across the board.
Yeah, I do want to come back to a question, and it's a great question, and one that probably suggests a follow-up webinar at some point. But really, there is some question that continues to be questions about the adequacy of the data, and whether we don't have a lot of data, and we don't have some established monitoring systems around access on various projects, offshore wind development, of methods approached. What's the comparison maybe between Europe and the Mid-Atlantic aren't accurate. So I think there are still some questions out there regarding whether or not we have the adequate data to really be able to analyze these impacts sufficiently. So again, a great question that I think, again, raises some public concerns. But what's your initial response to that? And what would your suggestion to be if we're going to have a webinar on how we would actually develop the adequacy of that data such that there is a greater degree of comfort out there relative to that? Any thoughts?
So I'd just say there's an awful lot of science that has been done in the last, 5 to 7 years. Kris made the point that that's resting on a good sound foundation of the ecological baseline studies that were done in the late 2000s that the NJDEP did. And, I would encourage folks to take a look at the RMI page, to look at ROSA and at RWSE, who are rapidly producing, I think, very sound, efforts to assess the potential impacts. And there are scientific studies that are being published in peer-reviewed journals that are, I think, addressing some of these questions in a peer-reviewed way, which, I think gives an additional level of, vetting by folks who are subject matter experts. So I'd say that, states are very thoughtful about trying to protect environment and ecosystems and recognizing the significant value of those resources to states and to the nation. And the science that's happened is extensive and I think pretty sound. And as scientific studies tend to go, right, you do the work and then you work to write up those results in peer-reviewed places where that work is vetted by subject matter experts. So I would encourage folks to follow up with the organizations, right? So RMI in New Jersey, you have eTwig in New York, and you have myriad other organizations in states along the Eastern Seaboard who are doing and funding this work, and also ROSA and RWSE. And then, those sites, if they don't point you directly to the peer-reviewed studies, folks in those organizations can help you see the peer-reviewed work that has come out of the science that was funded.
Great, thanks. Again, let's make sure we capture those questions too that are in the chat. If we haven't responded to them, I think most of the other ones have been responded to that I see. So with that, I'll just ask anybody if they have any final thoughts about if they had a magic wand, what they'd like to see done. Were there like top one or two things that they'd like to see action on? I mean, I'll start off by saying, as I said, I am very interested in a lot of this data and information, not only because of offshore wind, but very particularly because I want to know a lot more about the ecosystem so that I can manage multiple uses. So I want to make sure the whales can continue to get through. I want to make sure that the fisheries will be able to thrive in a heating moving frameworks. I want to be sure that the vessels can move through and then navigation. And so don't forget, we have offshore transmission lines. We have transmission lines for not only for energy that we need, but we also need them for telecommunications, and there are a lot of undersea cables that we need to think about. And I'm not. I do think we need to think about the security issues long term. Really make sure that we are doing these in a way that we understand what the vulnerabilities might be as a result of that. So I'm kind of interested not only in the potential for offshore wind, but also the potential for generating a lot of other benefits to communities and other interests in the region. So, any other last thoughts? I'm going to go down the line and ask you one at a time. Kris, any final thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. None of this happens if we don't have developers at the table. And if, we can talk all about wanting offshore wind and all the benefits, but if they're not here to build it for us, it's not going to happen. So reestablishing market confidence and, the myriad of ways that we referred to earlier, for me is paramount, because we can do all these great things about studies and transmission and things, but if we don't have anyone to build these projects, we are done with offshore wind. So we need to get them back in the market.
Great. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a real balance here, and I kind of want to make two very quick points. One is, you made a great point about all the data that we're gathering on offshore wind being able to be sort of repurposed to use for other industries. And we saw very recently a very sort of concrete example of that when NOAA in this administration just came out with an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and sort of hey, we're interested in doing this, to actually scale back some of the regulations on vessel speeds that are intended to protect North Atlantic right whales. And your reaction might be, what the heck? They're concerned about whales with respect to offshore wind, but when you look at the actual sort of much more sort of robust threats to right whales, which is vessel traffic and fishing gear entanglement and climate change, isn't that interesting? And the place where those things come together in a way that is just, has irony that you could cut with a knife, is the rationale for scaling back some of these vessel speed restrictions is, now we have all of these great remote sensing and monitoring technologies that we can use in a network to make sure that we know where the whales are in real time, so that vessels can go at a much faster speed and just slow down when they need to, and they'll have their transponder, and it'll signal them when there's a right whale in the area, and then they can slow down. Well, where did that network come from? It came from offshore wind. It came from regulators, sort of trying to impose, seeking to impose vessel speed restrictions that had created economic costs, time of year restrictions on construction, and the industry coming back and saying, hey, wait a second, there's a better way, and working with folks like RWSC, with the special initiative to try to come up with like technological solutions that can actually protect the environment better than the sort of old solutions that have been used for decades. And so you have this incredible sort of burst of innovation driven by this desire to find a more efficient solution to a problem, and now it's being used for other industries. So it is a great success story that is because of offshore wind and the sort of the innovation that was driven by the need to respond to regulation and to do the right thing to build responsibly and protect the environment. So I would leave folks with that example of how offshore wind is not just like a solution to our energy problems, but is a responsible industry that can solve problems in other industries and really across the board.
Great. Thank you. Kira, last word.
My last word is that we should not wait. Right now is the time to do the work for the reboot, and I think working together within our states, across agencies and across constituencies, but also with other states to lay the framework for the reboot of the offshore wind industry, because the energy landscape is going to continue to need a diversity of energy resources, and offshore wind is a proven technology that has been very viable in other use cases throughout the world. It is absolutely something we should be contemplating employing and working to build towards a future which has offshore wind as a significant part of energy portfolios along the Eastern Seaboard.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and everybody online for joining us today. Ongoing conversation, but this did help clarify my mind on a lot of the questions, and hopefully for some of you online as well. So again, thank you, Kris, Josh, and Kira. And keep in touch. If we can follow up on anything particular, please reach out to us at the Urban Coast Institute. We'll try to do the best to continue these conversations. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Have a good day.